Coming up, Big Blue prepares for the final preseason game against the Jets. Will the starters go? Who is going to be able to make a roster move for themselves as we look at bubble candidates and also some cuts to keep an eye on from across the stadium? We dive in coming up next. Yes, my friends, it is OGP, the One Giant Podcast, where you know that we are your hosts. Over here, Adam Armbrecht, over there, Andrew Makowitz. We're healthy, we're wealthy, we're wise, and we're ready for that final preseason game as we're going to talk about not only those elements on the field, Andy, but a couple of burning questions before we even tap into the Saturday night finale for both teams.
You know, Saturday night finale preseason is hard, especially on the home front, Adam. Like trying to explain how important it is to watch a preseason game that the starters potentially won't play in on a Saturday night in the summertime. It's tough sledding, my friend. I'm just going to throw that out there right away. So kudos to anyone that's figured out a way to be sitting on the couch, being able to watch all of these potential second and third string guys battle it out for roster spots.
I've seen over the first two games as well that, like, the first two preseason games, it's always a reminder because you're locked in. You want to see the reps. Obviously, last week we want to see Daniel Jones and these starters. But then, like, when you do get into the fourth quarter, it's always concerning the amount of time that I'm dedicating to it when Bob Papa is on TV going, well, and you can tell Brian Dable, we just fine ending this game right here. I'm like, well, come on, Bob. I'm staying pot committed. How come you're already selling me up the river 9 minutes to go in the fourth? And he's like, if we could end it right here, we would.
Yeah, he's like, everyone just run the ball, no penalties, no incompletions, just let's all get out of here. Meanwhile, these guys are literally fighting for their roster spots, their jobs, their lives are on the line. It is very interesting though, because most people walk away at about halftime. You and I are digging in. We gotta give the people what they want. We're there in the fourth quarter with 4 minutes to go, being like, did he do well in run blocking at the left guard position? Those are the big hitting questions that we bring to OGP.
It matters. That's the reps that really matter for us here. All right, before we get into the preview and some players to watch, especially around the bubble, both Giants Wire, Big Blue View, they kind of ran down the dialogue of it. If you're over on X, you could see how Dan Duggan, friend of the show, we like to say, he's never been on, but we're optimistic. He is now on the Azeez Ojulari train, which we'll discuss as well. But before we do, not only whether or not we think the starters or anyone will or should be playing in this final preseason game, a burning question for you, Andy.
Yeah, and maybe it's slightly related, but I was thinking about this when we talk about like players to watch, the bubble, all this stuff. Do you think that this last preseason game will decide the fate of certain players outside of injury? Like, do you think that there's someone that right now, Joe Shane and Brian Dable are like, he is not making the 53-man roster, that in the third and fourth quarter can do enough in this game for them to be like, you know what? I changed my mind. We have to keep that guy now.
Yeah, it's interesting because I would assume anybody that's bubble worthy and that they really are trying to make a difficult decision about, you see them first and second quarter, right? So by the third and fourth quarter, just from a numbers game, there will be players out there that are either going to make this roster already, like that aren't in doubt, but you have to fill it out for the final, 30 minutes of the game action. So I doubt it, I'll say, because it'd be weird to have a guy getting reps against fourth stringers or cut candidates for the Jets and going, I really love what he showed me that night. Maybe he makes his way through. So it probably does depend on, we already know the Jets aren't playing anybody coming into this game. So it probably depends on how long they run with their twos or maybe their threes. So the reps matter. Who you play against matters. Likely not, I'll say likely not.
Yeah, because there's guys like Ayer Asante, wide receiver for the Giants, who's had limited snaps. Like if he goes out there and all of a sudden,
Well,
like
passing reps won't matter at all. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, like if he catches 2 touchdowns and all of a sudden looks great, are you like, he could be the new Victor Cruz? He should be on this team.
I'll paint one scenario because we talked about this in our 53 man. I kept Bryce Ford Wheaton on the 53 man mostly for special teams. I could make a case that just by the numbers, there's a good chance that he'll be out there in the third and fourth quarter still. If Tommy DeVito finds him for a couple of nice passes, good, whatever, maybe it's the kind of thing that moves the needle for the coaching staff and saying, oh, game day, he's showing us something. Because it feels like for a player like that, and there's a lot of these guys on any roster, it feels like we've heard a lot of, we like the measurables, we like the work he puts in, the practices look good, but we haven't necessarily seen the pop in a game. Like maybe if you're talking about those margins like that, where he's, a guy that is fringe capable of being on this roster, and you're considering whether or not you're going to, we'll talk about other guys, keep a veteran wide receiver instead, like something like that potentially.
Yeah, it's funny because I used Ayer Asante first because he's more likely a practice squad player that's fighting
Right.
for a practice squad job. And I was going to say, even if he makes 2 touchdown catches, it's probably not going to change anything. But a guy like Bryce Ford Wheaton, to your point, like maybe he flashes, he's been around long enough where you're like, man, if we just saw a little bit more of that, like we could squint and really find
Of course.
maybe a way for him to make this roster. So I think it's fascinating to think about that.
The other thing then before we dive into players we're going to watch is whether or not the Giants starters should be getting reps in this game. We know Daniel Jones didn't have a great preseason debut a week ago. I don't think you or I mean, I know you and I did not overreact to it. We said, hey, it was bad. It didn't go well, but it also didn't change anything. And think of our perspective about, we'll find out when we get to the regular season where Daniel Jones is, what the offense looks like. I don't think they're exposing a lot. Where do you stand, not just on Daniel Jones, but any starter getting reps in this final preseason game?
Well, I did think it was noteworthy. Darius Slayton, who feels like the spokesperson for Daniel Jones on this team, he backs
Yeah.
him unequivocally. Like, what a great teammate he is, by the way. Like, he will go down with that ship. But
Yeah.
what he said is like, it's a can't win situation for Daniel Jones. You talk about how he hasn't stretched the field. Then they're saying in preseason is the time where you try to go like stretch the field and make mistakes. He throws a pick and he gets, chastised by everyone for throwing the pick. If in practice he doesn't throw into deep coverage against double coverage against Malik Neighbors, and he takes the 6-yard check down, they're like, "Here we go, check down Jones coming again." He's like, "What is the guy supposed to do if the
Right.
coverage is all deep and he takes what the defense gave him? You're not happy with that. But if he forces it in somewhere and throws a boneheaded pick, you're mad about that, even though you want him to stretch the field. It's a lose-lose situation, and that's almost why I don't see any reason why Daniel Jones should start in this game, because if that's what the defense is going to do, what are the 6-yard out routes or slant passes or quick things going to indicate to you about Daniel Jones? To me, there's not much more. He's in year 6. He has been
Yeah.
here forever. If you're telling me that 1 series or 2 series against the Jets second string is going to be an indication of what's going to happen in week 1, then we're in an even worse spot than I think that we're in right now.
Yeah, and I don't. The QB room is what it is, right? It's not one of these position battles where you're saying like, oh, well, if we, depending on what we see in this final preseason game, it could make a difference for what we do. So, it's funny too. Like Runyon, with a shoulder, he's still working his way back. You're obviously not going to they're not going to risk anything with any of those players. I wonder about, do you give them some guys just a couple of reps? We're going to get into some players that mostly are bubble watch, but a handful of guys that you just like to see some good reps from too. So I'm not going to care one way or the other if they play or don't play, but it is still going to leave what I think ultimately, barring this team coming out with their hair on fire in every preseason game, right? And lighting up the scoreboard on offense and shutting down, any level of string player on defense, you'd say, we'll know in September. It doesn't mean that these things don't matter and the joint practices don't matter, but you can't sit here and make definitive statements about what you think a player is or what you think an offensive unit is. We've already heard, I'll talk about Aaron Rodgers, quarterback for the Jets. He said, they're like, oh, these joint practices are so valuable, aren't they? Because you get these real live reps. He goes, yeah, on the one hand, it's good to get some live reps. The other side is, well, you don't want to risk showing too much to them because it's not about that we're going to see each other during the regular season, but they know a coach on another staff that maybe is going to play us, and they send a little hint their ways. Like, so I think everyone kind of hedges a bit. So rhythm, some timing, good, but all these things are relative to how they look when we get to the start of the season. That being the case, Andrew, let's turn our attention over to what we're watching, who we're watching, some bubble players, again, like I said, maybe some guys that I think could use some good reps. And all of this preview for the Giants-Jets final preseason game is brought to you by Potential. Pietential. That spells Potential.com. You head over there. It is a free online wellness assessment tool for individual users, sets a benchmark for your well-being, gives you tools to improve over time, and tracks your progress. It's a great way to start an NFL season, start the new year off. It's not as far away as we all may think. Check out Potential.com today and make sure that you got your wellness on track. All right, Andy. We look at this game. We talk about players that we want to watch for. We have a number of guys. I have a number of guys. If you're watching on YouTube, I don't know what order they're throwing up in. Boom! It was Evan Neal out the gate. Fantastic. I love going with this guy first. He has been injured. We talked about our 53 man. I called him a cut because I haven't seen him play this summer, and that's kind of important. He's been getting back. He's been getting reps at practice. do you feel like this actually falls into who should start? He has injury concerns, but do you feel like you would need to see Evan Neal show up and just put some decent reps on tape against even backups for the Jets that are still good players because they're deep at a lot of their defensive positions?
This is perfect. I
Thank you.
want Evan Neal to start at right tackle and play the first half. Like that to me is the ideal situation. The guy has been obviously injured, and when he hasn't been
Confirm or
injured, he
deny.
hasn't played well. You have to get him out there getting reps. If you think Evan Neal can still be a contributor on this roster, if you think he is the swing tackle on this roster, he has to get early reps against the Jets at him. For me, this is the perfect situation where you say, clearly, Illuminor has fought his way to be the right starting right tackle for this team. Evan Neal, you get the first half, maybe even and then some, to show that against second string guys, you are the better of the two second stringers. To me, this game is very important because if the backups for the Jets are running circles around Evan Neal or he looks slow or his feet look like he's lost again, you're like, man, how can we even trust you during a regular season game if you can't do it against backups in the preseason?
And that's where I think no matter what, whether or not Azudu's looked perfect this offseason, Joshua Miles, like there's been a lot of veteran players also brought in this offseason, as we know. No matter who you look inside of that offensive line, and we've seen some people talk about where are cut candidates or bubble guys. I'll mention Kubis here because I talked about him making the roster and giving 10 offensive linemen. You went with 9, which is where a lot of the speculation is. Like, are they willing to go that 10th guy? So when you talk about Evan Neal, man, like even if other players haven't been perfect, you haven't shown anything. So to your point, we're going to walk into the season and say, you know what it feel like? It feel like a year ago when we were talking about Matt Parrott is the backup swing tackle. Like that's the first guy we brought off the bench. I think that there would be a real concern about that, and obviously it'd be even more massive when we talk about Andrew Thomas. Knock on every piece of wood you can find going down. But if you're talking about Evan Neal needing to be a contributing role, then you have to be able to show something going into this week. I think that's a rare occasion where even though we know the pedigree is there, the proof hasn't been there. So I would put him on there. And to your point, at least the first half, or at least give me 3 full drives, right? Not four and out for 5 plays, whatever it may be. Like I need full drives where I see you rep over rep. We turn around and I say 20 to 25 reps, like, something in that range where it's a big enough sample size to make a judgment. Go ahead. Yeah.
I was just going to say one footnote. You mentioned Matt Parrott. I think it's really funny. He's now with the Denver Broncos, in case you didn't know where Matt Parrott went after he left the Giants. So far in the preseason, he's got like an 85 Pro Football Focus grade, and
Yeah,
he's like off the charts in run blocking and
of
pass
course it is.
protection. It is just, wouldn't it be just a chef's kiss if like he's the future right tackle for the Denver Broncos for the next decade, and the Giants could not figure it out when he was here? That to me, I just a side note of like, man, another guy that's left the Giants that maybe wasn't as bad as he indicated while playing for the Giants.
Whenever you can, the Giants will make the wrong choice around the offensive line. Quick footnote on a player like Tommy DeVito, who may play the entire game because the Giants only have the 3 quarterbacks. You may see him for 4 quarters. Why put him up here? Watch him, because in my version of things, and also Big Blue View, they talked about Tommy DeVito. They said, we think he makes the roster, but there's still a question on whether or not the Giants want to devote, a 3rd roster spot to the quarterback. They probably don't. So the world where DeVito plays an entire preseason game, especially against a lot of backups or whatever, if he looks clean, if he looks crisp, this spoke to your concern. All of a sudden, you try to get him through the practice squad, another team claims him. I don't think it's the end of the world, but just something to watch because Tommy DeVito's obviously been a fun story, and we'll see what happens with him because he's going to get big reps tonight.
Yeah, I
Tomorrow.
mean it's tough. Drew Lock is locked, pun intended,
Yeah,
in as your backup right now. You paid him the money to be that, so it's not really going to change. Tommy DeVito could throw 5 touchdowns. It doesn't impact whether or not Drew Lock is going to be the second string quarterback or backup quarterback to Daniel Jones come week 1. What would be nice is like maybe you do give Drew Lock the first series or 2 because his last
would
game
hate that.
action
Yeah,
didn't
yeah.
look great, was injured. Like maybe he just needs to feel a little bit more comfortable because we're like, if he needs to come in a pinch, we need him to feel as comfortable as possible. Well, like 1 series, 2 series, maybe the first quarter, and then Tommy DeVito take it away for the rest of the game.
And it's actually a really good point because if you're trying to determine whether or not you want to carry the 3rd quarterback, if Drew Lock looks nice and crisp, that probably just alleviates the concern around what we're going to do with Tommy. If he looks a little bit still suspect, and we know he's coming off injury, all that other stuff, whatever, then maybe you just find a way and you make a commitment to having that spot for Tommy DeVito. One other guy that I'll mention here that we don't have a picture up for, but I will say that Big Blue View had this referencing someone that I also mentioned. It's really fun because almost everybody that's getting listed here are guys that we talked about on our 53 and specifically referenced reasons why it's a delicate balance. Dante Miller. Dable has hinted that he sees Miller's speed and playmaking ability, but isn't sure the rookie free agent is ready to handle the nuance of the running back position at the NFL level. So this is where I wonder. He hasn't played a lot. I think they want to get him through the practice squad, but he's a guy to watch if he plays tonight. If he doesn't play tonight, it's not a negative. It just means the Giants are literally trying to have no one remember that he exists so they can get him through the practice squad. But that's why I put him on my 53 as going through there, because I just think it matters to have guys you can trust in that backfield. And we've seen some pretty good plays. Eric Gray, Tyrone Tracy Jr. is a bigger body guy to be able to handle some of even the pass blocking reps as well.
I think Lil Turbo, my guy, Turbo Miller, is going to make this roster.
Great.
I'm hoping that he does get a couple of reps because I think he's going to make the roster. So I don't think he's going to be one of those claim candidates that's going to be released. So I'd like to see him out there.
First quarter reps for Turbo Miller. You talk about, can anyone change anyone's mind here? If Turbo Miller comes in and gets 4 carries and breaks one of them off, right, and shows that speed to the edge like we saw on the 3 carries he had 2 weeks ago, right?
But does that change anything for you? Because, like, you already know.
It would cement things for fans, but it wouldn't change anything for the Giants. Like, the Giants know that already, right?
That's the thing. It's like his speed is unmistakable. Whether he breaks one off in this game or not, everyone has said, like, his speed pops when they watch him on the field. And so for me, I feel confident. Obviously he's had a little bit of an injury. I hope that he's healthy enough to be able to be out there. It would be nice to see Drew Lock and Turbo Miller in the backfield for at least a couple of reps, just because those are guys that I'm hoping are, ready to play or contribute for the Giants this season.
Preference would be too. I mean, honestly, I remember this happened a year ago when they did it with Eric Gray, but I would have liked to, if like Turbo Miller has this burst speed we all know about. Hey, special teams would have been really nice to see him this preseason, because then you'd say, hey, you want to carry 4 running backs, but guess what? Bryce Ford Wheaton, never mind. Or, McKenzie, who's looked like okay, but then you have Gunner down, right? It's like, hey, don't worry about it. We have this guy. He'll handle those reps, but we haven't really gotten that as well. Other players that we need to keep an eye on here. I'll just throw out, they threw out, could be Jacob Johnson, could be Jakob Johnson. We're not entirely sure, but that end fullback position, I only bring him up because we mentioned him. I said you can use that international spot for the extra one on the practice squad, then always call him up. And he talked about Robinson and Isaiah Hodgins. I actually think that that's a fun one to watch, though there's a world where neither of them really matters in the grand scheme of it. So they could be battling for other teams to think that it's interesting and they're curious about them. One other big player I'll just throw out on the offensive side, people will be shocked by this, John Michael Schmitz. We know that he's the starting center, but the PFF grades haven't been great. The eye test has been a little shaky, and he's had some injuries. I doubt he plays because of injury concerns, but I kind of think that this is going to be the first thing we look at week 1 of the regular season and go, okay, is he ready? Because there really is an unknown here based on his performance from a year ago. Everyone talks highly of him. Everyone thinks he's taking that step forward. But even the fact that it's now 2 years, 2 off seasons in a row where he has some injuries for himself that he carried into the regular season last year, there's something here that needs to be watched with a critical eye, given Joe Shane's track record with offensive line draft.
Yeah, I mean, listen, the fact that you're not going to start Andrew Thomas out there, it would be just devastating for him to get injured in a meaningless game right now. You're not going to get the consistency and continuity that maybe would help John Michael Schmitz in this game. If this was all starters are playing, you want him out there, right? You want him feeling how far John Runyon Jr. likes to slide to his left or his right. You want him to see what the cadence looks like with Greg Van Roten or Aaron Stinney or whoever is going to be in those spots. But the Giants aren't going to be playing those guys. And so while we want to see John Michael Schmitz, I kind of sit there and say, okay, well, how valuable is it if it's Joshua Zudu and Evan Neal and a couple of guys like Joshua Miles and others that are trying to make the roster? Does that give you any indication of what JMS will look like with this newly improved offensive line? So for me, because none of the other starters are playing, it's just a question mark going into the season. But I don't know if anything would really change my mind with him in this game against the Jets.
No, probably not. Just about reps, right? Do you think he needs live reps? Do we want to go that route? Other guys that have obviously been talked about in this game, we throw up Mr. Azeez Ojulari. He's a fascinating one, Andy. You can go back 3 weeks. I'll put the links in this show notes where we talked about this and Andy laid out his case for it. You can also go back to June 20th when we first discussed it about him being the guy to watch this offseason because he's in a contract year, because of the injuries, and because of declining play. And this was outlined really well by Andy. We've been on this for a while. And now everyone seems to be picking up steam on it. In spite of a lack of depth necessarily at certain positions on the defensive front, Azeez Ojulari is being talked about as maybe being a trade candidate, which is what the angle we kind of took here. Can get any value out of this guy. He matters in terms of these reps. Another team watching him, and for better or worse, dominate a bunch of backups for the Jets. Awesome. Maybe someone looks at it and says, that's perfect backup value for us. If you don't flash, though, then you're going the other way where I think teams just sit and say, great, you want to cut him, cut him. Like, we'll pick him up for free, but we're not getting into negotiations about taking on a little bit of money for you.
I mean, listen, I obviously have been on this for a while because I've just been reading the tea leaves ever since Hard Knocks came out. They basically gave you this script and it's playing out exactly how it looks. They said what Azeez Ojulari was showing on the field when he was healthy wasn't the best. When he was injured, he wasn't available to even play. And that's the reason why they went out and acquired a pass rusher like Brian Burns. And when they talked to Shane Bowen in the first meeting, they're like, so who could be another impact guy? They mentioned Ryder Anderson, who's not here anymore. And they mentioned Boogie Basham, who has had ups and downs, has looked good at some points and then struggled in others.
Right, fine. Yeah.
But they didn't mention Azeez Ojulari at all. And I think that was actually intentional because I don't know if his value for the Giants is really there. He is a backup player that is, as you mentioned, going into his last year of his contract, has been often injured. If he pulls his hamstring in week 1 or week 2, the Giants get zero value out of him and they're not going to re-sign him. Why not reallocate the resources that Azeez Ojulari's promise delivers and go out and get yourself a cornerback that maybe is in a similar position for another team? I'd rather take a risk on a cornerback that another team is fed up with than have Azeez Ojulari on the roster. The reallocation of funds is like the number one thing that I keep thinking about.
The only thing I'll say against this, which I'm more in Andy's camp than I'm not, is if you looked at his stats and his injuries and everything and the money, and he was on a different team right now, and the Giants were like, we really need some depth for our defensive front behind Brian Burns and Kayvon Thibodeau, I guarantee, name him Bob Johnson, we'd be sitting here saying like, hey, listen, here's a guy, he's had some injuries, he flashed when he was younger. Like, this would be the exact type of player that you would say, hey, so if the Giants can get him, it doesn't cost too much. You bring him in, you give him a shot. Hey, guess what? After this year, he's gone anyway. No overcommitment, late round pick. Like, there is just that other perspective where you go, and maybe that's why he ends up being here, because the internal conversation is, tell me that there's even a flyer guy that makes more sense that you can get relative to what you lose, the money you free up. If you want to go totally different position, I get it. Like, if it comes down to the numbers crunch, but I just think it is a good reminder of like, the grass is always greener. He hasn't been great, but he also has produced at a higher level than most players you would talk about in backup roles for teams.
You saying that, Adam, just made me think. It's like, the girlfriend or boyfriend of you're single and you see someone else has like a girlfriend or a boyfriend, and they're like, man, that person is nuts. They're keying cars, they're throwing things out the window, and you're kind of peeking and you're like, yeah, but that's like in that relationship. Like in mine, it totally would be fine. Like we would be successful together. We'd sing Kumbaya, go drink kombucha together, go on walks. And you're like, no. But like the car got keyed and the police were called over there. Like, you think that's going to change? I just think you're like, yeah, another team's problem for, our team's problem. It's just, it feels like there's so much scar tissue with the declining production from Azeez Ojulari and the injuries. It's really the injuries that concern me. And it's why the Giants felt the same way by going out and getting Brian Burns. This is an important game for Azeez Ojulari. It may be a showcase for another team to say, sure, come and get me and I will get, because for Azeez Ojulari, this is not even for the Giants, but like, he's got to build up his.
This is a contract year. This is a contract year for him. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
So he's looking at it and saying, how many reps am I going to get behind a potential all-pro and Brian Burns and Kayvon Thibodeau? I might not have enough opportunity to flash. What if the Carolina Panthers or someone else that are desperate for an edge rusher are saying, we'll give you the starting job and you get as many reps as you'd like to, reassess yourself? This is an important game for Azeez Ojulari if he plays to reset his market out there.
Yeah, and we won't even go further on him because there's plenty of other things we want to talk about here. The one note that I'll make, though, about it, and this is not related to him, remember a man named Lorenzo Carter, right? Who played for the Giants for 4 years. And he was fine. He had 5 sacks, four and a half, came and went, played some games, started a lot, and missed some in injuries in 2020. He turned around and went to Atlanta. And he'd say, yeah, great. Who cares? Why do we miss him? He has started all 17 games the first year. The second year, he became a backup. And when you go down and you look at it, guess what? 58 combined tackles, then 35. This past season alone, 24 solo, 11 assists, 6 tackles for a loss, 9 QB hits. So, and he had 21 combined over the last 2 seasons for them. All of that to say, and 7 sacks. It's like, hey, that's kind of a nice player, right? Like, sometimes and that's not about the Giants should have kept him. It's just sometimes you forget where value lies when you draft a player at a certain level and then you set certain expectations and then you have to reset them. So whether it's Azeez Ojulari or any of these players, guess what? Who another one may be, if I get this right. I pulled Isaiah Hodgins. I pulled Azeez Ojulari. There he is. DJ Davidson. He's another name here to watch for the New York Football Giants in this game because later round pick, obviously, already 25, going to be 26 years old. But if we're talking about the depth and we're talking about freeing up roster spots for other cut candidates, I think he's obviously going to be a big watch here because he certainly is a guy that he may not be able to move the needle for the organization in Saturday night's game. But he better do everything he can to try because right now it just feels like he's a non-factor as opposed to, are we sure we want him? We're debating this or a cornerback, a safety, whoever it may be. Right now I think it's put that down as a roster spot that we fill in with somebody else potentially. I had him making it, I think, and I got rid of Jordan Riley, but that's because I don't have confidence in any of these players in those backup roles.
I have DJ Davidson moving to the practice squad, a guy that can fill in a pinch for one game in case Dexter Lawrence comes up with a bum ankle or something like that. But really, for me, it's the obviously Dexter Lawrence and Nunez Roche are the nose tackle, defensive tackle, the tackles on this team that are starters. I like Jordan Riley and his upside more than DJ Davidson. Obviously, Elijah Chapman has flashed this preseason. Feels like those guys are the top 4. This is a big one for DJ Davidson because that defensive line is very thin. The Giants have talked about it at length. Yeah. If he can put some good tape out there, maybe he gives the Giants a chance to reconsider and say, you know what, we may have to keep 5 people across that defensive front instead of 4. So big night for DJ Davidson. Let's hope that there's not many penalties and let's hope that he can kind of move the line and tackle efficiently. I really want to see DJ Davidson out there because I feel like obviously it feels like Elijah Chapman has secured a roster spot. He is a guy that feels like he could either make the 53 or be a practice squad guy, or the Giants could say, we've seen enough. Maybe we're going to go in a different direction.
And of course, when we think about going to that linebacker and then into the safety room as well, it's kind of this slew of players because you can sit here and say, keep an eye on Deontay Johnson. The boot is off. He's not going to play this week. But in terms of his roster spot, well, Carter Coughlin's trying to come back in off of his injury. There's so many players in that room and so many injuries in that room that it's been this weird mix and match about who you think has value and what you could potentially show. Like special teams might be also like a big avenue to watch in this final preseason game. Cornerback obviously becomes very interesting. Big Blue View put this out here as being after Banks, Phillips, McLeod, and Flott, in spite of Flott's injuries, but we believe, the value to the team is there. There's never been a discussion about his, long-term future or short-term despite the injuries. They say everything else is up for grabs. Anything could go. Safety, same thing. They said they had Javarius Owens locked in there, but remember, Javarius Owens is also dealing with an injury. So now all of a sudden, for a 7th-round pick, who's been pretty good, who plays on special teams as well. Like, these are the roster spots that open up maybe for someone else to at least make the case. Remember, now until the 27th, 28th, maybe you make it because of the play you have on Saturday night, and you're still a holding spot that's holding their breath to see if they make the final 53.
Yeah, I mean, when you look across the cornerback room, you've got guys like David Long Jr., Trey Hawkins, Nick McLeod, Trey Herndon. We've talked about all these names where it's like, Darnay Holmes is another one. It's like all of these guys are vying for a back-end roster spot and potentially being a contributor on this team. I think you're going to see a lot of all of those names I mentioned and then some. There's a whole host of guys like Breon Borders and Mario Goodrich and others that you're going to be looking at and saying, is there a spot for them? How are they performing? How are they playing? What is their special teams value? Obviously, I know that there's other people in the safety room that we've talked about before, depending on how the Giants keep it for their flexibility, that may be able to flash again and give themselves an opportunity to make this roster.
Yeah, I find it at a minimum interesting and at a very high level fascinating. The one other thing that I want to bring up here when we talk about what to watch for on this game. Now, obviously, we already said the Jets are going to be playing all their backups. It's really not going to be something where we sit here and learn anything terribly specific for the New York Football Giants. What I would say is, though, when you flip it over and you talk about what are the potential players or battles that are happening over there, defensive tackle is one of the ones for the New York Jets. Right now, it's Quinnen Williams, it's Kinlaw, who's had a very good summer, it's Solomon Thomas, and it's also Fotu. Those are the top 4 players right now. Bruce Hector has bounced all over the league. He's been around since 2018. Okay. But also, rookie Leonard Taylor, an undrafted free agent from Miami, has made some splash plays, has had 3 tackles for a loss over the course of it, as well as Smart, who lined up in 7 games for the Jets in 22-23. I put it out there because if you're going to watch players and you're going to think about guys they may cut and maybe a undrafted rookie who's flashed in camp, hey, grab that beautiful little butterfly, right? Because bring him over to our squad and see if he can produce for us. Like when you look over at other teams that, especially defensively, are viewed as being very deep and very strong, their 5th defensive tackle might be our 3rd, right? Like, or might be, or could be even our 2nd. So like you have to look at them differently than the way other depth charts are presented.
Adam, that's a great call out. We also talked about this before the Lions game.
Yeah.
Remember, these joint practices are also beneficial for the other team that's actually scouting some of your fringe players. Maybe
Mm-hmm.
there's a deal to be made. This happens all the time in preseason where the Giants got a chance to look at some of these fringe guys for the Jets. Maybe they point and say, we can work with that. That's something that we can have. Remember, the Giants claimed Jason Pinnock before. Obviously, the Giants have claimed Isaiah Hodgins from the time in Buffalo. But the more familiarity you have with these players after seeing them in practice, what are their habits? Who are they hanging out with?
Yeah.
What's their training regimen? How injured are they? How do they think about the game? You get to see that firsthand. Those are experiences that you don't get when you say you don't play the Raiders and you're like, well, what does that 4th string guy bring to the table? All we have is the tape that's available to us. I wouldn't be surprised if someone from the Lions or the Jets, once the 53-man rosters get pared down, ends up being claimed by the Giants.
Yeah, I really wonder too. This is just as we at the end of the day wait for the final preseason game on Saturday night. I wonder how many reps in like joint practices that an offensive like the Giants, Brian Dable calls a specific play to see how the defensive tackles for the Jets perform against it, right? Like, it's like, hey, maybe if you say, I want to scout, I want to get samples here, run specific plays, see if they have the recognition, see if they can do certain things that you would want them to do to fit your scheme. Shane Bell's like, hey, run this so I can find out if this kid is capable of biting down towards the line of scrimmage, then turning his hips and getting deep on coverage, right? Like all those fun things. I wonder how many of those games go on, but we can't get out the door, Andy, without me saying that obviously our man Alex Johnson. Go check out the conversation we had with his agent George Holley yesterday. It was a really fun one. It's obviously some build up to what it is to make an NFL roster, the process that Alex Johnson went through, and then just what it is to represent players and how you want to help them succeed in their careers. A really fun conversation. But I still think that he's a guy that's going to get a ton of reps on Saturday night. Talk about who's going to get the most reps, deep depth players across the offensive line. You're going to see a lot of those guys. Talked about Evan Neal, a guy like Alex Johnson, who in theory right now is low on the depth chart, but injuries to Javarius Owens, questions about coverage ability inside of the linebacker and nickel room behind the starters. I continue to bang this drum. I'd love to see him come out and stand out on Saturday night because it's the kind of thing where if you want to players that earn it, get it, then Alex Johnson is on the verge of having earned a spot on the 53-man roster, and hopefully the Giants give it to him.
Yeah, it's going to be exciting to watch. These are the types of conversations that we love. It's not about whether John Michael Schmidt is going to start in the last preseason game
No.
because that really doesn't matter to me because he is going to be there week 1. He is, a high draft pick for the Giants. They need him to succeed. It's guys like Alex Johnson who go undrafted, who everyone looks at and is like, he has this versatility between being a nickel corner, a safety. Like he brings something to the room. You bring him in, and he's shown to have some really good tape. He's played hard. It seems like, he's going to get the opportunities to have a shot. You had him on making your roster, I believe, when we did the 53-man roster.
Yep.
Whereas I said he's probably a guy that you want to end up on the practice squad. That's why these games are important for someone like him, where like if he continues to put on film what he's been doing in training camp, there's a really good chance that he could make this roster. And so I definitely will be having an eye out for Alex Johnson.
And by the way, we talked about making the roster for Alex Johnson or anybody. Practice squad. We have 16 practice squad spots. How you perform in the game may not matter for making the 53 for a lot of guys, but it could matter for how you value your practice squad positions and how many you're willing to allocate to different spots. So it's going to be a really fun watch. We didn't get to the tight end room, and Jack Stoll, I think that he'll play as well. That's going to matter. I still think that it's a very fluid 3 and 4 tight end position, the fullback in Johnson as well. So there's a lot of things to watch for here just in terms of good reps. And by the way, watch it. And anybody that has good or bad reps that makes the roster, make a little note. So when we get to the regular season, we're watching to see whether or not that was just the guy trying to sort some things out, or problems that we potentially saw, and maybe upsides, maybe sleepers, maybe guys that we thought could be contributors like our boy Alex Johnson. That being the case, my friends. That's it. Saturday night special, final preseason game against the Jets will come in on Monday. We'll be just a couple days out at that point from the cut down date. Then you end up having the waiver claim period that happens the very next day on the 28th, done by noon. So we're going to have all that coverage going on and starting to curate our list of, hey, Giants are 6th on the waiver wire. Go ahead and line up the order that you want to grab some of these probably talented players, young, veteran, whatever it may be. There are going to be players out there for the Giants to improve their depth and improve their roster. Until then, though, get us over on YouTube. Go ahead and check us out over on your podcast feed. It's all One Giant Podcast. On X at One Giant Podcast, at ABAC214, and at Adam Armbrecht. But until the next time, until the best times, as Andrew Makowitz would want, need, and nay, demand the people know.
As always, let's go Big Blue.